Good morning, and thank you so much for inviting me to this very important conference. I'm sorry I can't be there in person because the dates clash with my schedule. I'm actually on the date of your conference, I'm away. I'm in Paris for another event. But I'm very privileged to be speaking to you even virtually. My background, as some of you may know, is in international communication. So my talk is around that subject, but on an aspect which is relatively underexplored in our field, which is the geopolitics of global communication, something I have been researching and writing about. And my talk today is really geared on that part of international communication. So I have a short PowerPoint, and I will like to share that with you. So when we speak of change in geopolitics, there are so many changes, and of course, in a short presentation, I can't, cover the whole gamut of issues, but I'm going to be focusing on the most important changes, and these are underway as we speak. So this is based on my recent book that's been published. It's called Changing Geopolitics of Global Communication, which is published a month ago. It is the first book-length study which explicitly links geopolitics with global communication. My background is actually in international relations. I have a PhD in international relations, and I've been teaching and researching and writing about global communication for now nearly 3 decades. So this is my most international relations book, of course, with the communication focus. The book essentially examines the changes and continuities in US-led global geopolitics, as well as its mediatization, how it is communicated to the world at large, where the role of media and communication becomes very important. It then also looks at the challenges posed by the rise of the rest to this system, which is really a Western system, US-dominated system, has been in place for at least half a century. In terms of post-globalization period, but has a much older history. So when we talk about change, what is the biggest change? And in my view, the biggest change is this so-called rise of the rest. Now that again is a very broad term, because who is included in the rest and who is not. So my focus within that is with the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Because to my mind, this grouping is actually very, very significant in terms of global geopolitics. Now, I had the good fortune of researching and writing about BRICS, especially media in BRICS countries. I was involved in a major project based in Finland, which examined for the first time the media and communication scene in these 5 countries. And we produced several things, including these 3 books. The last one was published in 2021, BRICS Media Reshaping the Global Communication Order, ? And this project was essentially run by Professor Carl A. Nordenström, who is a very well-known Finnish scholar of international communication. But I had an important contribution to this project. And we had teams in all the 5 countries, Russia, China, India, South Africa, and Brazil. And so it was a kind of first of its kind project. Now, when we were doing the last book, as I said, it came out in 2021. my friends and colleagues were telling me, why are you writing about something which is really not working? Because the countries that I mentioned, they are so different. China and India, you can't have a more different categories of countries, in terms of political systems, in terms of culture, in terms of economy, etc. And similarly, South Africa, Brazil, Russia, Brazil, there's so many differences in these countries. So there was a lot of kind of discussion that, maybe this is a dead horse, one shouldn't be flogging it. But I was sort of convinced that there's something in this grouping. This year, 6 more countries joined, although Argentina withdrew because there was a change of regime in that country. So you had Saudi Arabia, Iran, you had Egypt, you have United Arab Emirates, and you have Ethiopia. And many other countries are queuing up to join, including, I understand, Malaysia. Thailand has already formally applied. Turkey is interested. Indonesia is interested. Nigeria is interested. Mexico too. So just imagine, and Pakistan. So just imagine what that means to a grouping of nations, which are all of them non-Western nations. And rather than shrinking, they are actually expanding. Now, the idea of BRIC, as it was Brazil, Russia, India, and China, South Africa joined later on Chinese insistence, was essentially an idea which emerged from Russia. And it emerged at a time of great global change, which is 2008-9, when there was serious economic downturn in the United States, and it had repercussions around the world. So some major countries said, okay, we should get together and find an alternative system so we are not dependent on the vagaries of US domestic economic systems, housing market, for example, in that case. So it was a Russian idea. The first summit was held in Russia, but then gradually it was appropriated by China, because China being the most important of these 5 countries. And China also had its kind of geopolitical project, in the sense it was telling the world, especially the Western world, that look, we are not the only rising country. There are these other big countries, India, Brazil, Russia, and they are also rising. So don't get threatened by the rise of China. So essentially, the heart of it is China. Although, as you know, there are differences within BRICS countries. India, China, for example, they have rivalries, they have so many other issues to deal with, including border problems. But BRICS wouldn't be BRICS without the Chinese investment, Chinese support, and Chinese, in a kind of, although it's a group, so there isn't one leader, but essentially it's the Chinese dominated group. Now, so if you ask me what is the biggest change, in the broad terms, is the BRICS, and within BRICS is China, because China's presence, as people around the world see, is growing, and it's everywhere. And one of the most prominent example of that Chinese presence is this Belt and Road Initiative, which I'm sure many countries in Southeast Asia, as elsewhere, are involved in terms of doing projects with Chinese companies, government, etc. Now, this is the world's largest infrastructure project. We're talking about around 900 projects, 150 countries, $1 trillion plus. So it's massive. And within that, China is basically enhancing its presence across the globe. It has the original idea was Belt and Road, so it had a kind of, sea route, a maritime road, and as well as a land-based road, going back to ancient times and talking about Silk routes. Now, this is something which is already happening. It sort of started in 2013, so it's a decade-old arrangement. Of course, many of these projects are problematic. In many instances, some see it as a kind of debt trap. Others see, especially in the West, see it as a new form of colonization, this time coming from Beijing, not from Europe or America. But the facts on the ground are there that 150 countries are involved in this, some shape or form. And of course, this has implications about on the rest of the world, especially in the Western world. So China has at least on paper, a grand vision of what BRI means and what its implementation would mean for China. For example, they have created what they call a global development initiative, focusing on the countries of the global south. They also have a global security initiative, suggesting that there should be an alternative security framework, providing security to the parts of the world who are not secured by the Western-dominated systems. And they even have a global civilization initiative. They see, as anyone who is familiar with Chinese history would tell you, that China sees itself as a civilizational power, not just a nation state. As a nation state, is relatively new, it's only 75 years old, but as a civilization, it goes back much further back. Talking about at least 5,000 years, as the Chinese very fondly say. And these are having an impact in various parts of the world, whether it's in development discourse, whether it's security and civilizational discourse. And the idea that China often puts out in its media is that we are building a community of shared future. So the notion is that we're not threatening anyone. We are trying to create an alternative global system which is based on sharing and creating a global community. One of the most important aspects of these three I mentioned is the developmental aspect. A recent study published in the United States, the title itself is indicative: China's chance to lead, acquiring global influence via infrastructure development and digitalization. And if you look at recent expansion of Chinese presence around the world, certain characteristics are very, very clear. For example, exemplary poverty elimination record. China has, in one generation, they have taken 700 million people out of poverty, which has never been done anywhere else in the world. My own country, I come originally from India, has done very well, but still nowhere in comparison to what China has achieved. Because not long ago, China had the largest number of people living in extreme poverty in one country, as late as the early 1990s. Today, it's a very different story. Robust digital hardware, supply chains, and software. This, again, is extremely important. As we know, in this age of digitization, China has shown that it can develop its own hardware and its own platforms. And with these new digital Silk routes, these are now being sent across to various parts of the world, especially in the global south. And global south remains priority for China. Of course, it's operating globally, but that's the space where it sees potential to grow, especially in Africa. People to people communication, again, if you think about the number of Chinese students who are, studying in international universities, again, huge numbers, tourists, business people, etc. So there is a kind of interesting people-to-people communication taking place. And in fact, in recent years, there's been a little slowing down of the process, but the scale and scope of change is so profound. It's going to be a very important part of global communication. And the idea that you see in the official discourses of Chinese government, where the discussion is about dialogue of civilization rather than clash of civilization, which is something which we hear a lot emanating from the West, especially in relation to, say, Islamic world. Chinese have much more measured attitude towards it. Of course, this is a rhetoric. In real world, it doesn't, realize that sense, but the rhetoric is that we want a dialogue, we want to create a community of shared interests, we don't want a clash of civilization. Now, all this has to be then communicated to the world, where China has limitations because Chinese media systems are essentially dominated by the party state. It doesn't have the kind of media which has credibility internationally. And more often than not, it is seen as the mouthpiece of the powers, in more recently, the top leadership. So China has what a scholar described, undertaken a charm offensive. Here are a few recent and not so recent publications which sort of discussed it at some length, that Chinese soft power is visible, not just the hard power I mentioned earlier in terms of infrastructure development, BRI kind of projects, but also soft power in terms of media and communication, in terms of setting up Confucius institutes around the world, teaching foreigners Chinese language, Chinese art, Chinese history, Chinese cuisine, etc. And there's a very detailed and quite well-resourced project to communicate to the world globally. How successful that is, we can discuss that, because that's not quite clear. Partly because the global media system continues to be dominated by a few countries and corporations based there. Again, this is a well-known fact. I don't need to labor it, but just to share this chart, which gives you a sense of across the global elite media sectors, whether it is international news, television news, international newspapers, international radio, news agencies, financial media, even entertainment, and of course, the social media and internet. If you look at who are the big players globally, US is extremely important and is likely to remain. And there are reasons for it, and this is not the occasion to elaborate on those, but I think they are self-evident. And this then creates a problem for any change, like Rise of China and how it sees the world, its version of global commons, its view of a civilizational dialogue, for instance, because it is dealing with a system which is still to a very large extent, dominated by Anglo-American media. And so the way geopolitics is mediatized, it is very often through the Western and more specifically American media. And that then gives a certain, twist or certain slant to how news and information is distributed, whether it is the Ukraine crisis or look at what's happening in Gaza and now also in Lebanon, and you can see the kind of double standards in coverage of geopolitical stories. But the biggest threat to this US-dominated geopolitics and its mediatization is China, as I said before. And a recent report which came out from a US-based think tank summarized it rather well, why China is such a big issue for the West. So, biggest supplier, largest market, main geopolitical rival, and toughest competitor. Unlike the Soviet Union in the 50s and 60s and Japan in the 70s and 80s, China is pursuing global leadership along all four dimensions. It's the largest market in the world, it's the biggest supplier, its main geopolitical rival, its toughest competitor. Essentially, this is the Western, more specifically American view. China has lifted more people out of poverty faster than any society in human history, while differing sharply from established Western norms. So a one-party state has achieved what great democracies, thriving democracies, for example, next door in India, have not been able to do in terms of eliminating poverty, extreme poverty. So obviously, these four dimensions, supply, market, geopolitics, and competition, has made sure that China remains much bigger rival, challenger, if you like, than any other country. Now, one of the things that I have done in the book, which I think is new and perhaps needs more work by other scholars, especially younger scholars, is to look at how what I call epistemic communities, think tanks, universities, NGOs, other experts, how they shape this mediatization of geopolitical stories in the media, because often we tend to criticize the media without looking at what is the source, where are the narratives coming from, who is providing the intellectual input to media organizations. And this is, again, a very interesting area, as I said, largely underexplored in our field. But way back in 1965, there was a book published by Arthur Schlesinger, who was a very famous American historian. He defined the Council on Foreign Relations, one of the most important think tank in the United States, 100 years old, as the front organization of the American establishment, and the New York Times and the Journal Foreign Affairs, its organs. So Council on Foreign Relations has a journal called Foreign Affairs, which is also, some of you may have used it. It's very, very influential, arguably the most influential journal in the world in terms of international relations. And it's been going on for 100 years. And the New York Times is the public-facing front. And they called it Organs of American Establishment. This is in 1965 at the height of the Cold War. Today, of course, New York Times remains arguably the most powerful newspaper in the world. Foreign Affairs remains the most, I don't think there's not much argument about that, most influential journal in the field. And Council on Foreign Relations, arguably, again, the most important think tank. But there's been a growth of think tanks in the world, and these think tanks are not only providing the input, they are in some ways shaping the narrative. This is from a recent study published in the US, kind of global study of think tanks, and I'm quoting from it. It is now a completely regular occurrence to see an expert from one think tank or another being quoted in top-tier media on major issues of international policy. They provide a much more than media course and have become an important part of the policy-making process across the world. And of course, majority of most influential think tanks are in the Western world, especially in the United States, although in terms of absolute number, China has many more than US even, but they are not that influential beyond the Chinese-speaking world. Another discussion, not this time, about why that is the case. But I want to end with some reflections about how this Western domination itself is now a little bit unsure. Because, and it's not just, as I said at the very beginning, it's not just the Chinese are becoming more visible. There are many other countries which are more assertive, Russia being a case in point. But India too, supposed to be close to the West, but took a position on Ukraine, which was strikingly different from what the Western policy was, whether it's European or American, a certain kind of autonomy in foreign policy. So the Western dominant thinking is also a bit affected by these changes. And I want to just reflect on that very briefly. The idea of Westlessness, this is a rather awkward phrase in English, but it was the title of the 2020 Munich Security Conference. This is a very famous annual event. It happens every year in Munich, has been going on for many decades. And this sort of reflects the kind of confusion in Western thinking about the world and its role in it. This is 2020. This is before Ukraine happened, right? So Europe wasn't threatened by Russia then. This is the agenda for Munich Security Conference. This is how they define, and I'm paraphrasing it, about what Westlessness is. Feeling of uneasiness and restlessness about the enduring purpose of the West. Decay of the Western project. Western societies and governments have lost a common understanding of what it even means to be part of the West. And the West come up with a joint strategy for a new era of great power competition. So, as you see in this very crude summary of what the report says, there is confusion. There is a sense that we have lost that status we had in terms of setting the agenda. We tell people what to do and they will do it. Now that is not happening. And it's interesting to see that the attitude towards the Ukraine conflict in the BRICS countries, I already mentioned India, but even Brazil and South Africa, was very different than the European or Western. More recently, in the Gaza crisis, remember it was South Africa which went to the International Court of Justice to take Israel there for what it described as genocide in Gaza. Now, this is a, kind of indication of how things are changing. A more recent work on this actually is interesting. The book has come out with that title, just been out, fresh from the press. It's simply called Restlessness, the Great Global Rebalancing by Samir Puri, who former diplomat, academic, very interesting book. And he defines restlessness as the declining slice of the global pie held by Western nations, peoples in demographic, economic, military, and cultural terms. We are hurtling towards a far more diverse global future. Many of our certainties about the present, built on centuries of Western influence, are being questioned afresh by people the world over. The receding of Western global influence is speeding up, shaking the ground under our feet. So provocative, but one would, at least I think, quite close to the truth. That is not to say that the West has ceased to be important. It remains very, very important. In fact, arguably the most important, and not collective West, but within that United States, of course. So the title less, not post-West. So let me then conclude with some reflections about within all this change, why China remains the most important player outside the Western world. China changing global geopolitics. I have a question mark because China has its own set of problems, and more recently we've seen in last couple of years, the economy is not also doing as well as it was doing for many decades prior to that. The journal I mentioned earlier, Foreign Affairs, in June this year, it had a cover story. Can China remake the world? This is at a time when China is supposed to be, its economy is kind of not growing as fast. It's not as important in Western discourse anyway. But this is the headline cover page of the most influential journal. So why is it changing? BRICS, I mentioned BRICS Plus, I mentioned already in the beginning, and BRI. Cyber sovereignty and data localization. Now, China, as many of us know, has its own internet, its own platforms, its own cyberspace. Those of you who traveled to China know it. You can't access the kind of platforms you and I use, whether it's Facebook or Google or Amazon. They have their own version of all these. And there's a whole debate in China about cyber sovereignty and localization of data. And as Chinese companies go around the world, think of a TikTok, for example, and the data localization issues are also now affecting China because China wants to keep the data of all these global operations in China. Competing platform imperialism. I already indicated the importance of platforms, but the only competition is with the United States-based platforms, which are global, but China is increasingly, through also its BRI projects, trying to push its platforms, some of which, like Tencent, Alibaba, etc., are already operating outside the Chinese cyberspace. No other country has its own systems. The Russians were forced to devise their own since the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. And there are some other, but in terms of big players, China remains the most important. And that's then also led to a kind of digital Cold War and weaponization of information. I have a whole chapter in the book about that, about weaponization of information. But digital Cold War is something real, and it's about who is in control of the new global um, digital systems. Now, also in relation to AI, artificial intelligence. Uh, Here again, the competition is between China and the United States, which of course is the most important player. Digital for development. I also indicated this at the beginning. China has done extremely well in this field, but so has other BRICS countries. India would be another example where digitization has been extremely successful in terms of providing the bottom of the pyramid, the poorest people, access to digital technology, and through that transfer of government welfare schemes to the poorest. And that has made a huge difference. Future historians would wonder how they did it in such short period of time. And there are other cases across the developing world. So that model is now being replicated in different parts, and that is also creating problems for the aid industry in the West, because they've been removing poverty for 50 years and it hasn't been removed. So now people are looking for other alternatives. And finally, what this new Cold War has also indicated is there is a trend towards deglobalization, in the sense that nations are thinking increasingly in their own, inward-looking thinking, whether it's in the US or the Brexit project in the UK, or revival of nationalism or religious, identity across the Islamic world, in India in terms of Hindu nationalism. Turkey is an interesting example of how Turkey is resurrecting its old history as an Ottoman, empire, and how it can replicate that in the 21st century. And of course, China, there's a lot of nationalism on its social media space, and of course, Russia too. So all these changes are leading to a kind of deglobalization process, as well as what I call de-Americanization of the internet, because, as I mentioned in relation to China, which has the largest internet in the world, by the way, is increasingly working outside the American system. Russia was forced to be outside the American system, and there are other countries, whether it's in Europe, Japan, and South Korea, or India, where they are working towards developing their own platforms and not being dependent on the hardware of basically US-based companies. So that, in a nutshell, is the change and change in geopolitics, and how it is mediatized still remains an issue, because the international media and communication structures haven't changed that much. Still, the most important, the two operating systems for mobile telephones are both based in the United States. One is owned by Google, the other is owned by Apple. And all of us use mobile phones. So the hegemony of the United States has not gone, and it's not going to go anytime soon, but there are very significant changes taking place, with some of which fundamentally challenge that structure. And that's the core argument of the book I've just published. I want to thank the organizers once again for giving me this opportunity to share some of those ideas with you. I would have very much liked to be there in person, but unfortunately I couldn't. So I wish the conference all the very best, and hope to visit you some other time. Thank you very much.